I was watching a video from one of the American universities the other day on YouTube, and it was about, what was it about? It was a kind of psychology or brain science video. I can't remember the exact title of it. But it was about patterns of activation in the brain and how concepts form part of those patterns of activation. And specifically it was to do with prediction, I guess, and how we go about anticipating what happens next in any particular pattern of activity, what kind of guesses we make about the future, and how that sense of anticipation is represented in neural terms. And there were several interesting things about this that I found interesting in this particular presentation. One was to do with this model of brain activation as being a series of kind of swooping journeys of these activation patterns through the various regions of the brain. And one of the things this guy was saying was that, whilst it's probably a robust idea that different areas of the brain kind of hang on to specific concepts, so there does seem to be an area of the brain which is specifically associated with, vertical lines or faces or whatever. That's not, that representation isn't a kind of solid, coherent object. There aren't grandmother neurons in that classic sense that, at least the way he was talking about it. You can't excise 3 or 4 neurons and just completely remove a concept, because they're fuzzy concepts. They're not represented in that kind of even way. They're represented more radially as kind of categories of concepts blurring out into other concepts. And what he said was that when we think of an idea, or when an idea, isn't even right to say when an idea passes through our thoughts, when our thought processes pass through an idea, the actual meaning of that idea, the meaningfulness of it, the role that idea plays in our thinking at that moment, is entirely dependent upon the trajectory of that thought pattern as it moves through it. So if I'm thinking about a circle, for example, I was thinking about circles this morning, that's why I'm saying that. If I'm thinking about a circle, the process of my thinking is that pattern of activation contains neural circuits which are activating in sequence, complex sequences, lots and lots of feedback loops. But that sequence is sweeping through this area of my brain which has something to do with circles, and then sweeping out the other side. And the actual specific role that the concept of circle means in that thought is entirely dependent about the trajectory, where that sweeping has come from and where it goes to. Rather like the way a musical note works in a musical composition. The specific role that a note takes in any musical composition, the kind of meaningfulness it has, or salience or relevance or whatever you want to call it, of a particular note, doesn't adhere to the note itself. It's entirely dependent upon the notes which have preceded it, the trajectory in, and the notes which are antecedent to it, the trajectory out of that note. So, for example, a particular high note in a musical composition, when placed at the end, is very different to that same high note when it's placed more towards the beginning. A composition that ends on a high note is likely to be quite different to a composition that begins high and then ends perhaps more somberly, let's say. So that's this idea of this kind of sweeping through of thoughts through these rather strange multidimensional landscape of concepts, patterns of activation. One of the things I found quite interesting about that, one of the many things I found quite interesting about it actually, was what this chap was saying in terms of the main thrust of his talk, which is to do with anticipation and prediction, and how that trajectory leads out of a particular concept, a particular area of the brain. Because what he was saying, which I think is quite right, is that when we hear a concept or when we hear a set of musical notes, it's not that our consciousness just stops at the moment of our hearing, where the moment of our listening is already anticipating the next moment. So when we hear a set of notes on a climbing scale, we can already kind of hear where that scale is going. Or when we hear a set of it's almost like you throw a ball in the air. When you see a ball in the air, you don't think, well, I wonder where that's going to go next. You can kind of see its trajectory, you can kind of feel its trajectory in advance of it actually going along it. And what he was saying with that is that quite clearly some patterns of activation, some of these sweeps that go through our concepts, have quite well-defined trajectories out the other end of a concept, in the way that the trajectory of a ball is very well defined. If you look at a ball in flight in the air, there's not much doubt about where it's going to go. It only has one path to travel in, really. And similarly with some musical patterns, if you stop a relatively straightforward musical composition halfway through, you can usually guess the next 2 or 3 notes, and you'll probably be right most of the time, because they follow regular patterns. But some ideas don't. Some wandering about doesn't. As I'm walking up this path near this little industrial park, there's a 99% chance that my next footstep is going to be in the next stage of this path, but there is a slight chance I could step to the side. So there's always some slight anticipation, some vagary in that anticipation. Some other options are always open. And in this presentation, the way this guy was describing that was in terms of a kind of probability gradient in a landscape. He was saying that as these activation patterns sweep through concepts, even before we are aware that we're thinking of it, there is patterns of activation set up in multiple pathways out of that concept. So if I'm moving my thoughts through into thinking about circles, as I approach this idea of thinking about a circle, there's already a whole set of different activation patterns preparing themselves outside of that, on the other side of that concept, through which I could travel. And I think there's some kind of Bayesian network idea in play that, where each of these things is weighted. The likelihood of each of these possible exit points is weighted. And the idea is that with very familiar things, like the musical notes that I mentioned, there's a very strong weighting to some of those exit patterns. But with something more vague, like my approach to this word circle, or my approach to the concept circle, I really got no idea what I would do with that thought. Then there's a whole range of different activation patterns, probably equally weighted, which means that the gradient, the probability gradient of my thoughts following any one of those particular tracks would be much more flat. If it's a very predictable exit point, then the probability gradient forms a kind of valley, and the sweeping or the kind of rolling ball of my thoughts at that moment tends to follow that valley of thought onto the next concept. It's a fascinating idea, really, I think, that idea that this experience that we have, which is a routine lived experience, I guess, that the future is this kind of blinding mirage, and it gets more mirage-like the further into the future you get. More and more probabilities open up in terms of what one can do with one's life, or where one might walk on a path. The further ahead you look, the next step is highly constrained. And if you're following a pattern in which the probability gradient has got a very steep-sided valley to it, then the level of predictability and the range of possible exit points is necessarily limited. Let's call this my hand holding this camera is absolutely freezing.